What's up, squad? This is Devil Heroes. Welcome to the Meta Shift Volume 2, a weekly tier list where you get down with the meta. I can't believe I just said that. So first, let's jump into the patch notes. Alright, starting out this week, we have buffs to pretty much everything. I like to see that. The 3 assassin buff will start out with, it's going to get a 5% increase in critical strike chance, which is technically 50%. That's a pretty large buff. It'll definitely help. The 6 assassin buff is going to get a 50% increase in critical strike damage. Now that's not quite what it needed, but any buff is going to be good for now, right? Sideboard's early game is buffed with the 2 engineer buff going from 45 HP to 60 HP. That's just good all around, you know, like I think small increases are always best versus like big massive changes. The 4 engineer buff goes from 120 HP to 150 HP, so you're going to be getting 30 extra HP per second once you get your 6 cyborg buff. Steel Fist and Ground Smasher both got armor buffs, but then the big thing that for cyborgs for me is that Steel Fist went from being like a very bad unit to a very strong unit because of these buffs. The thing you gotta remember about Steel Fist is that his ultimate hits 7 times, guys. So the 50 damage he gets at 1 star is going to become 350 damage, and the 100 extra damage he gets at 3 stars is going to become 700 extra damage every time he uses his ultimate. The one nerf to cyborgs though is that scouting drone goes from hitting 5 targets at 3 stars and 4 targets at 2 stars to 3 targets at all points in the game. It was definitely one of the most overtuned units in the game. It's still going to be super strong with items. They have a little bit of a change. This doesn't affect gameplay, but now we actually know why it did so much damage. It was a true damage ultimate, so it was avoiding all armor, which is just insanity. I think this nerf is definitely needed. But then the big change for me for cyborgs and why it's going to be a legitimate build in this tier list now is because now at level 9 you go from getting a 2% chance to pick up legendaries to a 3% chance to pick up legendaries. That's a 50% increase. You have a much higher chance of picking up the cyborgs you need once you get to level 9, which is just a great all-around buff. Sorcerers are the other big winner of this patch. Humans are like one of the main parts of the build, right? So increasing mana regen from humans adds like increased consistency to this build, which was one of the major issues. Previous to this, you were basically just like getting 6 humans and then coin flipping, right? Now you're going to get at 6 humans, you're going to get an additional 4 mana per second, going from 3 mana to 7 mana. So you're going to get your ultimates much faster. Flamecaller's ultimate goes from hitting the highest level unit on the board to a random unit. If you think about this, this is a very big buff. It's not just quality of life, because the highest level unit will usually have the most health. So her ultimate works based on hopefully killing off a unit. So hitting a random unit instead of the highest level unit, explode in like the AoE radius that you really want to happen. Lightbringer is getting a pretty big all-around buff, almost a 50% damage increase, up to like nearly 70% at her max attack damage, and she's getting roughly a 20% attack speed nerf. So all around she is going to be even more consistent as well. She's going to be getting her ultimate much faster from her mana gain. Void Destruction gets a pretty hefty early game buff, which is pretty great. Sorcerers were already pretty much one-shotting builds late game, so I think buffing their early game is really going to help. Moonlight Dragon's ultimate is now shields people instead of healing. This isn't that big of a change, but the damage and shielding is going to be increased, which is just going to be great for sorcerers in general. That's 4 units that are buffed along with the human buff adding to consistency. That finishes up the patch notes for July 30th. Let's jump into the rest of this tier list. As usual, our unique strong tier list is going to start off with Guru. He is always going to be picked, no matter what. Period. Drop the mic. Best unit in the game. Next up we have Warlocks. We'll get into those a little later, but basically every single one of these Warlocks is a pickup, depending on the stage of the game you're in. Berserker, General Puffer, and General of War are both warriors, which we still find to be one of our strongest comps in the game. We'll get into that at a later point, but on their own, these units can pretty much be picked up as well because of their strong ultimates in the case of General Puffer and the General of War. And Berserker is a goblin and just a really strong DPS unit that can really shine in any like protect the carry comp. We have the CC Trinity in the bottom right. As we mentioned, General of War, King of the Sea, Shuraka, and Kraken are really strong units. So if you can pick any of these up, they'll fit in pretty much any comp as like, you know, your 9th or 10th, or even hopefully 8th, 9th, and 10th unit if you can get the whole Trinity going. Sword Dancer is absolutely still on the list, especially with the Assassin buff coming through this week. Witch Doctor is also there because of the Mana Crystal shenanigans we still haven't made the video on, but hopefully we get to that this weekend. That pretty much sums up our unique and strong tier list. Let's jump into some of the races and classes that we believe are pretty strong all around. You guys have seen this slide before. Warlocks are still OP. The ultimates that each of the units have, except the 1-star Voodoo Elder, are very strong, potentially some of the best in the game. Not only is the Warlock synergy itself particularly strong, you can use some of these units by themselves to pick up other race synergies like Goblin, Beast, and especially Undead. Like we said in the last video, although we suggested going for Misfortune and Void Doom in some of our original OG tier lists, now we believe that almost all these Warlocks are beneficial because of their races. If you're running the Warlock buff, all around you're just going to be running Warlocks as maybe your 9th and 10th piece if you get to that point. So Hunters, we're actually kind of removing the Hunters from most of our actual comps. That's because they're very meta. They have extremely strong pieces. Shirakaka! And the Kraken are both pretty strong units. They're part of the CC Trinity, so they're extremely contested. As we mentioned in our 1-cost tier list, the Hog Rider is also a very heavily contested unit because it's a rider, a hunter, and a goblin. Scouting Drone has been known for a while to be a very strong unit, so it's getting picked up very often, and it's hard to get to 2 or 3 stars, along with Sideboards becoming very popular this patch. And now Scouting Drone itself was nerfed quite substantially in the late game, so we want to see you guys using Hunters to get to the late game, but not necessarily put all your eggs in the Hunter basket anymore. Getting multiple Hunter units to 2 and 3 stars is going to get harder and harder now, so we're trying to help you guys beat the meta a little bit. Just a last note to reiterate everything, pretty much all the Hunter units are pretty strong, and they don't particularly need the Hunter synergy, so don't force yourself into using, 3 to 6 Hunters. Feel free to just pick up the Hunters themselves. Before we jump into the actual comps I think are pretty strong in this meta, I just want to go over something. The reason I don't put these actual builds into like an S tier, an A tier, a B tier, and an F tier is one of the main skills to Chess Rush is making sure that you are versatile. So if I told you, for example, like the next build, which I do believe is one of the strongest builds, is S tier, I don't want you just forcing it every time. The reason I have these builds is so you understand what you're going to build into late game. You don't want to force a 6 warrior build. You just want to understand, based on the units you receive in that game, like what your ultimate late game will be, okay? So moving on, I just want you guys to understand that based on the units you pick up, you will end up using these comps in your late game. I feel that all of these builds that I'm showing you today have the ability to get first place. Alright, last week you guys saw a build pretty similar to this, but because of the heavy contestation rate of all the hunters now, I genuinely believe that this is actually a little better. We'll focus on the 6 warrior and 2 warlock. That's going to be one of the stronger, most consistent builds of the meta this week. We were using the hunters in the past because they provided some pretty good backline damage, but now with the just your warlocks in general, who are providing pretty good sustained damage, you don't need to use the heavily contested hunters anymore. We do mention crowd control because the CC Trinity is still exceptionally strong. That Kraken and General of War are just great units. We'll be making a video shortly on positioning and how you should position certain compositions, but for now I'm just going to mention their name. They kind of make sense just by name. You're going to be running this 6 warrior 2 warlock comp with either an open fort or a corner +1. Alright, next up on the tier list we actually have cyborg assassins. Now, as we mentioned in the patch notes, both cyborgs and assassins were actually buffed this patch. Steel Fist got a very heavy buff, as we mentioned. His ultimate at 1 star is now hitting 350 damage harder, along with the armor and the health advantage he now has. The Ground Smasher also is going to do increased true damage. He's got a little armor buff, and then Engineers have got a nice little hefty HP buff early and late game. And the big change to this, like we're just going to reiterate it because this build went from going from, you know, trash tier, I just had to include it because people were building it, to much more consistent build. The reason why it's more consistent though is because now at level 9 you actually have a 3% chance of picking up legendaries, which doesn't seem like a big change from 2%, but it's big. You're going to be seeing your legendary units much more often. I still think you put your DPS items on the Sideboard because he's especially strong, but assassins are definitely going to be the way for you to hold your mid game. With Steel Fist and Ground Smasher at becoming pretty strong tanks, you're going to keep these units in throughout the game. The Miss Supersonic or the Stalker Drone on your bench if you don't upgrade them. All the assassins are pretty strong, so feel free to use any of them, but if you're using units like Lilith or Venom, make sure you're kind of positioning them in the ranged areas so that way they can safely auto attack and get their ultimates off. More of that in the positioning guide that's going to come out. All around, I'm pretty happy with this build now, and it can get my seal of approval. That was a little fake little like stamp I just did, but you're welcome. Next up we have riders. Like I mentioned at the start before we got into these comps, there is no real tier to any of these. Like almost all these builds can win now, depending on how you use your economy and stuff, and riders is no exception to this. Because humans did get buffed though, 2 of the very strong units in this comp, the Templar and the Dragoon, are a little more heavily contested, but the overall like rider meta that people were so obsessed with has started to slow down. Which isn't the rider meta anymore, just some people aren't able to watch my tier list. Anyways, the hunter version, like we kind of mentioned before, is a little, in some of the other builds, is a little more contested, but it works particularly well with this build because the Hog Rider is a rider and a hunter, so you're going to be able to like sneak by with synergies a little easier than some of the other builds. Using Warlock in the Rider Hunter build is going to be pretty good. 6 riders, 3 hunters, and 2 warlocks. Late game is just nasty. Goblin Rider is something we're going to get into at the end of the video. It's actually the meta shift pick of the week, but just briefly into it, you do need to pick up your goblins early. The Totem Face, the Voodoo Elder, and the Hog Rider. But like I said, we'll get into that in more detail. Sum things up though, Rider is still definitely a strong synergy and will guarantee you, you know, top 4, top 3, like pretty much every game because of the pretty safe early and mid game. The 6 human and 6 sorcerer. Alright, now we have the coin flip build. Anyways, it's much more consistent than the coin flip, as we mentioned. The fact that you're getting a whole lot of units buffed now. The flame caller is just a much more consistent unit, along with Lightbringer doing so much more on her auto attack. This build is very strong. I'm like digging it right now. You do need to, like we mentioned in the past, you need to corner it a little bit. We'll be getting into like a positioning guide, hopefully by the end of the weekend. Look for a link in the description. All around exceptional build now. The problems it had with consistency are starting to get solved, along with just like several of the important units getting buffed. Now our loser for this week is going to be the Punisher build. In the past we've almost always suggested this is one of the strongest builds. It's still a pretty strong build. It's just that all the other builds now don't have such restrictions like the Punisher does now. You can't even collect demons. You can't collect more than one demon until you get the Nightingale and the Devourer. Although you can high roll especially hard with this build and just crush everything, it's just so much harder to run now because you do need to get that Devourer and the Nightingale by like pretty much like round 15, if not earlier. It does have like a lot of possibilities, but we're not going to get too much into it this week because it's honestly it's getting a little lackluster, kind of due to power creep. It's not extreme power creep, but the drawbacks of this build are just a little too hard to make it consistent, which is what we've talked about. One of the most important factors in determining the effectiveness of a build. Alright, so now we have our meta shift pick of the week. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. So the Goblin Rider build is pretty strong. She said Goblin Rider Warlock. This is what I like to call the Berserker comp. You're going to be looking for your goblins early. If you can't pick up the Totem Face, the Hog Rider, and the Voodoo Elder at about 2 stars, this build isn't going to be super effective because, as we mentioned in our 1-cost tier list this past week, Totem Face is just a terrible unit. If you are able to pull off 4 goblins, able to get your 4 riders, you can get extremely spicy by picking up 4 warlocks. This isn't something I mention very often, but the fact that Hog Rider is a rider and a goblin, and the fact that Voodoo Elder is a goblin and a warlock, lets you squeeze in 4 goblins, 4 warlocks, and 4 riders. This is just, it's so good. If you can't get the 4 warlocks, you're gonna look for adding in some of the pieces of the CC Trinity, you know, the General of War and the Kraken. All around, you know, you're looking at the Berserker to like hardcore carry you. If you do end up getting the 4 Warlock part of this build, the Berserker can kind of get to a position where he can, like, if he's got like 3-4 units that are half HP at the end, he can 1 versus 4 them because of his Goblin attack speed buff and his 4 Warlock. Either version of this build works, the heavy Warlock or the heavy CC. That's gonna sum up our meta shift of the week. If you enjoyed this video, guys, I love that guy. He's such a beast. Stream Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday from 1 to 4 p.m. Tuesdays is Sub Tuesdays, where we give out a sub to the most active chatter. And Fridays we have viewer games. Hit that like, subscribe button below. Yo, I really appreciate all you guys. Deuces. Sharakaka.